quality of work.
Total architecture.
Humane organization.
Straight and honorable dealings.
Social usefulness.
Reasonable prosperity of members.
We are engineers, consultants, planners, designers, artists, researchers working together to solve some of the world's most complex problems.
And I think we've shown over the last 75 years that we can adapt to a changing marketplace, and we will continue to do so in the future.
Kia ora and welcome back to our afternoon session. This session now turns to public transport and urban regeneration. We heard yesterday of the increasing focus on our large cities, both by young people leaving the regions and for those immigrating to New Zealand. How we operate our big cities and how we constantly evolve them to adapt to changing populations and changing ways of living is a key issue, most recently in relation to the announcements made on housing. I will now hand over to Infrastructure New Zealand board member Phil Guernsey to take us into this session. Thank you, Phil.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mai, haere mai. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Richard Cani, Group Planning Leader for Arup, to our stage today. Richard leads Arup's global planning cities business. As an urban planner and a transport planner, he brings over 25 years experience of all aspects of planning, transport in cities, including leading and supporting some of the major urban regeneration projects in the UK. And that's where tonight he beams to us from. Richard's experience has also included 15 years at Transport for London, where Richard was involved in all aspects of TfL's long-term strategy and development, planning and project delivery, leading the development and delivery of the transport strategy for London. Richard brings extensive experience in integrated land use and transport planning, with a track record of delivering some of the major transport projects in London over the last 3 decades. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Richard to the stage.
Great, thank you very much, and good afternoon, and great to be with you, and thank you for having me. What I wanted to do was to share some of my experiences of the role transport plays in creating healthy, inclusive and sustainable cities. And the first point I wanted to make is we often think about transport in isolation. We think of it as networks, as operations, as assets. But for me, transport is the lifeblood of cities. And it manifests itself in different ways. We have different physical networks. We have stations, we have streets, we have walkways, cycleways. But the function of a city and its transport networks are, for me, one and the same thing. Good, successful, healthy, inclusive cities have successful transport networks. But transport is not an end to itself. For the vast majority of people, transport is a means to an end. And primarily, it's about connecting people with opportunities, whether that's around work, seeing friends, family, accessing education, other public services. Transport is part of life of the city. And we have to acknowledge as well that not all cities are equal, and people living in cities have different opportunities and different chances in life. And transport is one of those really unique elements of city life that brings people together. These two diagrams show London and Los Angeles, and those darker colours show the areas of the cities that are the most deprived. And transport is really the key ingredient that connects those communities to areas of opportunity elsewhere in the city. So if we get this right, transport can contribute to supporting more equitable and inclusive societies. But also transport can contribute to quality of life. And how we plan, design, integrate and operate our transport networks can make a huge difference in how people perceive and experience the quality of their urban experience, whether they're living there or whether they're a visitor. These images show Copenhagen in Denmark, and Copenhagen is often kind of cited as one of the most livable, one of the most accessible, and one of the most easy to move around cities in Europe. And I think when you look at the way the transport system integrates with the streets, the public realm, the function of the city, and how accessible and inclusive it is to almost everybody that lives there, you can see why that's very much a just recognition for how Copenhagen functions. Also, at a more micro level in urban areas, transport can contribute to successful urban neighbourhoods in terms of the quality of that urban environment, how inclusive they are, how safe and healthy they are. And we've seen over the last 18 months, certainly in the UK and in most urban areas, this kind of reawakening and this kind of focusing on local and people being forced in many cases to spend time locally, but also spending, realizing what they want from their local neighborhoods. So the role that, good planning, good design, and the way we integrate our transport networks plays in achieving those compact, sustainable, healthy urban neighborhoods is really, really important and at the fore of our thinking at the moment. It also contributes directly to health and well-being. This is some work we did at TfL looking at the direct contribution transport makes to the health of Londoners. And there are a whole series of health impacts that can be improved by planning and operating our transport network in a particular way. Main focus on physical activity, and the diagram on the right shows the proportion of adults in London who could meet their physical activity needs on a daily basis through more walking and cycling, with the lower bar showing where they are today and the upper bar showing what's potential. So transport can have a huge role to play in improving the health and well-being of people living in cities. Also a major catalyst for city transformation and change. I love this diagram. It's Times Square in New York. And if anyone's visited New York over the last decade, you can see some of the major transformation that's happened in this part of the city from Times Square down Broadway. These areas were formerly dominated by traffic. They were very heavily congested and the pedestrian and the kind of city life was very much pushed to the margins. But the kind of pedestrianisation and the reallocation of that road space to public events, to public realm, to pop-ups, to recreational space and facilities for walking and cycling has transformed that part of the city, not just for people who are walking and moving through it, but for businesses and people who live there as well. It's also a trigger for physical change and growth. I know this conference has talked a great deal about housing and the role that transport can play, but making the right investment decisions and looking at this in an integrated way across planning and transport, we can use transport as a major lever to unlock housing and other growth opportunities. This is the former power station site in Battersea in London, where over 20,000 homes and 15,000 jobs have been delivered around a new extension of the tube network, fully integrated, but also the way the development is being planned and delivered is also contributing to the funding of the transport network itself. But also when you think about how transport interfaces with cities, there is a huge amount of physical infrastructure as well. And this research done from the University of California sort of really shines a light on that and highlights that in some American cities, up to 30% of the physical urban space is dominated by roadways. So that space that often has no civic function, it's segregated from other people, and it's used primarily for the function of vehicles. So really the dominance of transport can also have a negative impact on how cities function as well. And that can cause community severance. So again, this research that was done by Professor Peter Jones looks at the kind of, the causes of community severance, who's impacted, how they're impacted, in what way, and where they're impacted. So really bringing to life how we can, divide neighborhoods if we get transport wrong. And this is a great example. This is San Francisco, and this photograph on the left is an image that could be replicated in a number of cities, possibly parts of Auckland as well, actually, when you can see highway infrastructure that was built in the 60s and 70s, for a very good reason, all about movement, about connectivity, about keeping traffic separate from neighborhoods. These were the principles that planners were working to at the time, but you can see how it's physically divided parts of the city from its waterfront. That land wasn't valued at the time. It wasn't seen so important from a development perspective, from an amenity perspective. But the removal of that highway for a number of reasons, but the removal of that highway has created a whole new district of San Francisco and transformed the way the city relates to its waterfront by creating new public space, new connections, but also increasing the values across large parts of the city. And the diagram at the bottom is something from the US, where there is a debate happening at the moment about some of the decisions that were taken around highway infrastructure and how that's divided cities, and how some of the measures that need to be taken now to kind of retrofit that, to try and reconnect those communities together, to create more inclusive and connected. But also, if we get this wrong, there are significant externalities and negative impacts from our transport networks on cities. Congestion, we can see that on the image. There's some data there from TomTom, the most congested cities of the world. Many of these are in developing countries where they've got rapid population growth, urbanization. The transport networks are catching up with population growth, but not all of them are. So again, we know when things aren't planned properly, when we've got, excessive, travel demands, there are significant impacts on communities and local people. That impacts on carbon emissions. And you can see the graph there from 1990 to 2018, the green line at the bottom, and the contribution transport's making to carbon emissions. And the majority of that, as you can see from the right, is coming from road-based transport, but also significant air pollution effects. And we're having a very significant debate here in the UK about the impact of air pollution, particularly from diesel vehicles, which has led to a series of restrictions, bans, low emission zones, and the phasing out of diesel vehicles. But we also have particulates that we need to address as well. These will continue to be a problem, even with electric vehicles. And we know there is a direct connection between air pollution and health. We had some very tragic events here in London, and for the first time, air pollution was cited as the cause of death for a young girl who lived close to the urban ring road in London because of particulates. So there's a whole movement happening here about the health impact of vehicles, which is really driving change around how we see our road network and creating a very, very strong energy and a dynamic for doing something very different about our highway network and the balance of transport in our cities. But we're also seeing substantial change as well. We've all experienced the impact of COVID around our lifestyle, around changes in behavior, and also the introductions of technology and how we can do things like this, which 2 or 3 years ago would have been quite challenging to do. So nobody knows what the long-term effects of that are going to be. We're seeing significant kind of upticks in our transport demand in London. We're seeing it more at the weekend than the week. So less people are returning to normal during the week from a working perspective, but more people are returning to normal to socialize at the weekend and go shopping, which is quite interesting. So people are craving human interaction, and you see that with the crowds on the tube at the weekend, but you don't see it so much during the week because, excuse me, many people are still working from home and taking advantage of the technology. But we've also got new mobility providers, appearing, all over. We've got shared mobility, we've got micro mobility, we've got applications that give us mobility as a service, that give us more choice and more freedoms to make decisions in a different way. So this combination of demand factors and changes in supply will impact on future travel demand, and how we integrate and incorporate that in our cities is one of the key questions for the future. Also, one of the challenges we have with transport in cities, we often manage it in silos and isolation. This is Los Angeles, and I think this is a great example. Very large city region, broken down into a number of very distinct city districts, but also the transport operations through the operations of the metro, the rail network, the road network, the bus transit network, and the land use planning network, all separate agencies. So the ability to kind of look holistically at the problem is really constrained by the fragmented nature of the governance. But also that doesn't reflect the reality of how people live their lives. The diagram on the left is the commuting patterns to Los Angeles, so where people are actually living and traveling from to work, and that cuts across all of those boundaries. So the way that we've organized transport is often a reflection of the past rather than how people are living their lives now and the choices they want to make in the future. We also have to acknowledge that not all cities have the same building blocks in place. Cities like London, New York have got, transit networks and metro networks that have been there for, 150 years. So we have other challenges around the age of the assets, but we've got a very strong foundation to build on. But other cities are in the process of developing their transit networks. So the ability to move large volumes onto public transport away from car is more challenging. So just to sort of conclude, there's 5 principles I wanted to talk about that from my experience, I think underpin, the creation of healthy, inclusive and sustainable cities from a transport perspective. First of those is we need to put outcomes. The outcomes we want from transport are the heart of planning and operations and delivery, and establish ways of measuring performance against these outcomes, drawing on new sources of data. And just a few illustrations on the right of the kind of outcomes I think we should be focusing on. So streets will be safe, clean and green. More people will use public transport. More people will walk and cycle. every home will be within 10 minutes walk of transit. So focus on outcomes rather than outputs. The second is something we talk about a lot as professionals in this subject, land use and transport integration. For me, as an urban planner and a transport planner, this is kind of absolutely obvious. If we get this right, if we integrate land use and transport planning, everything else is easier around the decisions that we need to take and some of the behavioural changes we want to achieve around transport. When we see that done well, and the image on the right is Singapore with the Land Transport Authority, that by necessity, because of the size of Singapore, they have to integrate their land use and transport planning, you deliver very, very positive results around the kind of outcomes you want around transport. So integrating those land use and transport planning functions, I think, is an essential foundation for good holistic city planning. The third of those is integrated transport planning and operations. If we want to deliver particular outcomes around behaviour change, for example, people driving less, using public transport more, taking short trips on foot and by cycle, perhaps travelling less at peak times, the way that we achieve that by integrating and planning across a number of modes of transport. So integrated transport authorities is, alongside integrated transport and land use planning, are two of the strong foundations that give us the ability to achieve the outcomes we want. The diagram on the right is some of the functions that TfL has. So over its 20-year life, it's, year by year taken on more responsibility to become a more integrated and holistic transport authority. And the fourth is to put people and place at the heart of everything. As I said earlier, transport, for the vast majority of people, transport is not an end itself, but it's a means to an end. And this requires a deep understanding of the drivers of demand, which vary from place to place and will be different for future generations to the last. So we need to kind of, put people in place, understand the distinct differences within places, the different needs, the different challenges in different neighbourhoods, different communities, think about the future generations, what their drivers of demand are going to be, and put that at the heart of our thinking around future transport in cities. And finally, we need to fix a pathway to decarbonise. Transport contributes towards roughly a third of carbon emissions. That varies, by city and country. But decarbonising transport network requires a multifaceted approach. And just a few basic principles from my experience on the right. The first of those is data and analysis. Until we know what the causes of transport carbon emissions are, it's very hard to develop strategies that are going to achieve the outcomes we want. We don't always have that data, so collecting that data and building an evidence base and reviewing that on a regular basis is a really important part of that understanding. The second is reducing transport energy demand by reducing the need to travel, by more active travel, by less motorised modes, by more efficient use of existing networks, so getting more from what we've got. The third is decarbonising transport energy demand. So those people that do need to travel, and there'll be many of them, making sure they can do that in a decarbonised way. So that's electrification of fleets, it's new technology, for example, hydrogen. And I would say that New Zealand's been at the forefront of some of the thinking on hydrogen technology around transport. And finally, mitigating remaining impacts through carbon capture, storage, and offsetting. And the final point I wanted to make, when we think about this in a city context, we're often dealing with quite historic transport legacy assets. These are big, lumpy things. They're quite difficult to deal with. They're expensive. They're heavily used. You can't take them out of action. They're part of the physical fabric, but they can have significant detrimental effects on the direction we want to take cities in. So I do think it's possible to reimagine transport as well, without taking it all down and starting again. Just a couple of examples to finish on. This is a competition that we did with our winning entry in New York for the Brooklyn Bridge. So looking at reimagining how the Brooklyn Bridge could function in the future, having significant regard to the impact of the infrastructure around the bridge, particularly the approach roads, the freeways, and the way they connect into the bridge, and how we can humanize elements of that and better integrate it into the urban fabric. And finally, the Presidio Parkway in San Francisco, again, an existing highway connecting the downtown with the bridge, and how by putting that in a tunnel, immediately connects one green space with another. So transforming the amenity value of that green space, reconnecting communities with the full waterfront, and transforming that part of the city. So I hope there's been some thoughts there that have been of interest for this discussion, and it's great to be able to share those with you. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, Mayurie, to chair the panel. Thank you.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the following on from that fantastic keynote from Richard de Cani. So our panel today brings an outstanding wealth of information and experience in city shaping, urban planning, and urban regeneration, and also experience in governance and leadership of complex transport multimodal entities. So to start off introducing our panel, we've got Malcolm Smith. Malcolm is the Australasian leader, cities leader, and an Arup fellow in master planning and urban design. He's responsible for guiding design strategy for master planning projects across the world. His work not only centers around physical issues of places, it also encompasses systems integration, resource efficiency, cultural strategy, meaningful infrastructure, risk and resilience, and social value. He has recently led a research program on the role of open space in cities in a post-COVID context. Next, I've got Tommy Parker. Tommy is the program director for the Auckland Light Rail Establishment Unit. Tommy leads New Zealand's largest ever infrastructure investment and transformational multi-agency urban and transport project. He's also the Australasian consulting leader for Arup. Tommy's leadership in sustainability, resilience, and the environment has seen the delivery of challenging infrastructure projects that respond to complex problems both in the United Kingdom and in New Zealand. Tommy has held senior management and governance roles with Waka Kotahi NZTA and Auckland Transport. Next, I've got Rebecca Hollett. Rebecca is Aurecon's rail client leader and principal infrastructure advisor with an extensive experience in infrastructure project definition, planning, design, and delivery across Australia and New Zealand. She has recently collaborated with Auckland Transport, KiwiRail, and Waka Kotahi on rail programs to enable the realization of benefits of recent investment in the Auckland rail network, and has led the development of delivering the goods, Auckland's freight plan, in collaboration with various agencies and industry. And I have Adrienne Young-Cooper. Adrienne Young-Cooper is the board chair of Auckland Transport and has a background in strategic city planning and has been an independent director on resource, transport, housing, and urban development companies for almost 20 years. Adrienne's driving passion as a professional director is to support the creation of sustainable, beautiful, and diverse communities that are well connected by transport networks and services. It's in her view that transport investment must support and incentivize sustainable urban development and position New Zealand for a net zero carbon future. So if we connect to the messages from the keynote from Richard, we're at a fork in the road. There were 5 key outcomes he put on the table that guide the framework that he was taking us through in the keynote. He said planning for outcomes, land use and transport integration, integrating transport planning and operations across the multimodal system, creating places with people at the heart of it, a pathway to decarbonize the land transport system. I think about Richard's keynote, I think about the minister's address, and I think about how much alignment there is about those messages. So context setting here, there's a clear opportunity for us to stop thinking of our transport projects as transport projects, but frame them for city shaping to realize the tangible, wider benefits they bring. We have a decarbonization agenda, so how communities and cities are planned, designed, developed, integrated with a multimodal transport entity is critical. What is the opportunity for the integration of transport planning and operations across the system? And then there is the how do you pay for all of this? So with that, I'm going to throw on to the, I guess, the first question to Malcolm. Malcolm, I hope you're ready for this. Can you share with us some of your international experiences and insights on how we unlock the wider benefits around these city shaping opportunities?
Mayurie, thank you for that, and thank you to Richard. What a great context setting. Look, I'm delighted to be coming today to you from not as far as Richard, but from the land of the Wurundjeri people, Melbourne, Australia. So, and having had the pleasure of working with Richard for many years. But look, I wanted to maybe as someone participating in the kind of the city making scale, of which transport is one of those key devices, tools, assets that we deploy, I wanted to add another dimension into this discussion, and that is the dimension of time. There's a really powerful quote that resonates with me when we do our work on cities, and it's from a guy called Patrick Geddes. And Patrick was a Scottish philosopher planner, and he said something like this: a city is more than the place in space, it is the journey in time. Now, I'm sure when he was using the word journey, he wasn't thinking about transport. He was talking about the passage of time of cities. And Richard has delightfully outlined the examples of where, cities have been influenced by their transport systems. I have to think in most of those occasions, whether we look at the 18 lanes freeways of Los Angeles or the conditions, all of those were done with good intent. And they were done at a point in time that there was a new technology that might have been around, the kind of the aspiration of the private car forming Los Angeles. But we sometimes forget, when examples like Richard quoted on Copenhagen, that it took 30 to 40 years to transform Copenhagen to the way we see it today. And so this journey in time, I think, is a really important issue of implementation, because transport is a process of often large infrastructure, of a consensus of policy, of a scale of implementation that takes time. But I guess I was wondering, in the question of where do we see, how can we take advantage of that? How can we understand it? I guess there were a few thoughts that I just wanted to leave on the table today. The first thing I do, I guess, when we approach, city strategy in relation to transport, is almost ask the question, as we are thinking of the new, are we able to undo conditions after us? Just like the laying down of the motorways in Los Angeles, of big infrastructure projects that, were laid with good intent. Can we be on the journey of city making that undoes things? And then I think it's the process of how do you curate city making in relation to transport. And look, I wanted to throw a few examples, at the forum to explore this from around the world. But I guess when we're looking at this, it's very important for us to understand the trajectory of a city. Why cities come about, and Richard laid some of those rules down. But look, Mayurie, just a few thoughts on different ways in which this journey in time we embark in relation to public transport. The first one is, they take a while to come into fruition. They free up pieces of land, they open up opportunity. But we often make the mistake of jumping to end state city making instead of thinking of curating as we build up temporary land uses. And I think we're learning this around the world. And there's some beautiful examples to see, particularly that I've seen in Auckland, of how do we use temporary land use to begin to create this process of evolution. The second one that I want to do is the repurposing. Richard alluded to the Brooklyn Bridge. We were involved in a competition at the heart of Porsche and Mercedes in Stuttgart, where an 8-lane road down the middle of the city is being descaled, repurposed, occupied by mixes of uses, more open space. And so the asset of transport infrastructure is being repurposed. Now we can see that in examples of the High Line. So it's not always about pulling it out. Sometimes it's about repurposing. There are more strategic opportunities being taken around the world. We see the role of Paris, the pedestrianisation of the Champs-Élysées an incredible new urban project, or the kind of core policy position of making diesel vehicles illegal in the central area of Paris. We're seeing the new layers of metro or light rail systems that are increasing this connectivity of the way in which people can operate. And then Richard talked about the policy and the governance that comes around, and I'll leave those after me to talk about it. So maybe in our time, as we're addressing these issues of health, of digital, of time poorness, of an authenticity of place, the transport and the way the systems come together, I think is something that is very interesting to me. And I think we're seeing it around the world in those different ways, from curating the change of place over time against those 5 nice principles that Richard laid out, would be my way to talk about implementation. Enjoy the journey over time, not just the idea of the physical making of place.
Well, it's beautiful. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you very much. So I might then go to Tommy and just Tommy, with Auckland Light Rail as the name of the project, but now everyone who talks about it really recognizes what an incredible city shaping urban regeneration opportunity that this transport infrastructure enables. Please, can you share your insights on the opportunities and the challenges you have discovered in the past 6 months as you have led the entity and delivered this phase of the project?
Yes, thanks, Mayurie. Certainly, I've had a very interesting last 6 months as we've developed the business case for the project and submitted it to the ministers for consideration. And maybe you're right. The name of the project maybe does need to be broadened out, because what we've seen is much more realisation of the extent of the project and the outcomes. And whilst we've delivered a positive business case, and that is largely down to the benefits that come from the land use and the opportunities for communities and stakeholders along the route. And I think we've really seen this shift in conversation as we've talked to stakeholders, partners, and the communities. When the project in the past has been perhaps perceived, even called city centre to airport, because people see it as the fast route to the airport that they would use when they're going to catch their flight. But now, as we've shifted and developed the business case, it's much more about that realising quality urban form and the compact city that Auckland's been aspiring to for a while. And I think it's becoming clearer that you're not going to achieve the kind of compact city form that we're seeking without interventions such as light rail. So we've got a positive business case, but as I say, that does rely heavily on us achieving the urban benefits that we've identified. And it's been interesting, Mayurie, as we've been talking to the communities and the strong appetite that we've got within the communities to embrace the change and to use the rail as a catalyst for broader change within their areas. I think particularly some of the South Auckland communities that currently have very low levels of public transport access, they are seeing the opportunities and ready to embrace the conversation around how this can help them. And really interesting, our stakeholder engagement has shown particularly strong enthusiasm amongst the younger generations and the youth who are wanting to see perhaps different lifestyle opportunities within their city. We're also starting a very positive conversation with the Property Council, with the development industry, about how the market would respond to this investment and what are the opportunities for them to perhaps provide different forms of development, both housing, lifestyle, and employment. So, very much looking forward to taking the project through to the next level. In terms of some of the challenges that we've got, look, there is definitely concern within Auckland communities around what urban intensification means. and what will successful intensification within Auckland look like and feel like, and how will that change the lifestyles. There's a particularly interesting debate around, maybe we call it gentrification. I know Malcolm's got a different word for it, but it's this not pricing people out of their communities. We want to see the uplift and the improvement to the communities that the route connects with, without taking the community soul away from that area, and making sure that that benefit is felt by the people live there. Auckland has, in the past, we've seen people like communities have to move out of areas when they've become too expensive. So an interesting design challenge there as to how we get the urban mix right to benefit those people that live there now, and the people that will come there in the future. I think another challenge is around disruption. These interventions and developments do have a long development plan. We've seen with CRL that particularly high levels of concern amongst small business owners, and we have to challenge ourselves to do better in that regard. And then I think the other challenge we have going forward is getting the skills, the capability, and the resources to lead what is a huge project with huge opportunities and huge challenges. So making sure that the industry is ready to respond and is thinking the right way and developing the right skills for the longer term transformation. So those are my thoughts at the moment. Thank you, Mayurie.
Thank you, Tommy. Just maybe with the level of interest everyone has, is there anything you can share with us on what's coming up next?
So yes, we work our political masters for their consideration, but we will be looking to progress the project, and really the next to develop the design. It comes to what Richard was saying. We've got to now develop the design for the rail totally integrated with the community master plan. So start looking at where the station locations would be in a master plan for the corridor that embraces and gives realisation to the benefits that we've identified. So yeah, we're looking to bring in the teams that can give us that integrated thinking between the urban outcomes and the transport outcomes. And we know that in order to get these benefits, it's going to be a multi-agency effort. We need to collaborate. We need to work together. Private sector, iwi, council, Crown agencies, because owns all of this project. Everyone has to contribute to make it successful. So looking at who does what and how we make it so that New Zealand Inc. as a whole can contribute to this exciting opportunity.
Thank you, Tommy. That was really, really insightful for me. So really appreciate you sharing your experience and insights from the project. Rebecca, if we can come on to you now, we can have a bit of a conversation with your infrastructure advisory background and your insights and your experience in Western Australia. How have you seen organizations tackle these challenges around delivering the transit-oriented development?
Yeah, kia ora, Mayurie and everyone. I've been in New Zealand now for a few years, but I grew up and earned my stripes in Western Australia. So I think I imagine 3 layers when I picture that long-term journey that Malcolm has alluded to, from ideas to reality of transit-oriented development. The first is to have a really clear vision. I think the WA government has done a lot of good work in metropolitan planning beyond the horizon, starting in 1955 with the adoption of the Stevenson-Hepburn Plan. And I did a business case for a key multi-modal corridor a few years ago, where that corridor had been allocated as part of the 1970 corridor plan. The latest strategies support a more compact and environmentally sustainable city, but they naturally need to work from the historic patterns of urban growth. The second layer is that a strategy is only really as good as its implementation toolkit. And so the policies and whatnot that will support it to achieve the vision. In keeping with the theme of this afternoon's session, which includes diversity, I wanted to raise employment self-sufficiency targets, which is one of the policies that the West Australian government has used as a method of planning for diversity. In Western Australia, those targets were set in a strategy of Directions 2031 and beyond. And they've driven local governments to think much more critically about density and the mix of land uses, particularly around those highly accessible centres, such as those with rail and mass rapid transit stations. So employment self-sufficiency is an economic measure, a ratio of local jobs to the local labour force, and it has been much debated in terms of its effectiveness as a policy approach. The land use and transport feedback cycle is complex, but research does suggest that self-containment is achievable through good planning of transit-oriented development. To integrate jobs and residents using public transport means people have much more diversity and choice closer to where they live. So bus networks can be well utilised for shorter trips within the centre catchments and also serve to feed the rapid transit networks within those centres that provide for trips between activity centres, ultimately giving people sustainable choice in how they live, work and play. Thirdly, I wanted to talk about the role of planning instruments or mechanisms to achieve the long-term vision. Entities like Development Western Australia have legislative powers to deliver urban and regional transformation, which they're doing through a portfolio of economic and employment lands, industrial, commercial and residential projects. Development WA develops and administers planning frameworks. So they prepare the redevelopment scheme, the policies and the guidelines. And once those are adopted, the planning authority for the scheme area is formally transferred to that entity, and they manage the development delivery process from there. Because the mechanics are probably less important than what can be achieved. And I'll share an example. The last in the long line of some of the strategies I've talked about in Western Australia is the 2018 Perth and Peel at 3.5 million, which set out the land use planning and infrastructure frameworks aiming to accommodate 3.5 million people in that region by 2050, with a network of strategic active mode road and public transport linkages. That includes MetroNet, which is the single largest investment in public transport that Perth has seen. And there's about a $3 billion contribution from the Australian government, about $6 billion by the state, towards around 15 or so projects, which are integrated, a systems approach, including metro rail and multimodal interchanges, freight depots, signalling that systems of operation approach that Richard referred to. Bringing it back to New Zealand, I guess there's so much that can be done to better utilise, expand and integrate our systems. And key to that is that land use mix and I think the self-sufficiency view across our activity centres. It's really easy to forget that Auckland's only had an electrified rail network for about 7 years. And with that improvement in experience, patronage has leapt ahead. I was working in AT with the Integrated Network Planning team when the 100 million public transport trips milestone was achieved. It was a memorable moment. And with further investment over the next decade or so, those further step changes can be realised. So coming back to that example of MetroNet, I see similarities. Not only has the infrastructure investment been made, but it's been supported by Development WA as an entity to achieve and deliver urban redevelopment. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was extremely insightful. We might come back to you with a couple of questions after I do the full panel. Adrienne, I'll come to you now, and I think the question to you is purposeful urban intensification around public transport investment. Please, can you share some of your insights on where you've seen us, as in us in New Zealand, do this well and then not so well?
Kia ora tātou, and thank you, Mayurie. Look, I wanted to talk a little bit, starting out just actually with some of the basics. I was at a presentation last week about noise and how people respond to noise. And it was about transport noise. The most unwanted transport noise is actually the sound of planes and the sound of helicopters. The next most unwanted noise and disliked noise is general traffic, including buses and trucks and cars. The most liked noise actually is trains. This is quite a large survey that we've done. And I've got no doubt that surface light rail, which is even quieter, actually has got the potential to be amongst the most desirable of noises. And if we stop and think for a moment about the noise of walking and cycling, what we have is the odd bell and the chatter of human voices. And I would say that was the most desirable noise of all. And that goes to actually how we should be thinking about urban intensification. We want people to be living in environments that they desire and they like and actually create. And so that when there is noise, as you know, cities are very busy and they're very noisy, that actually we are thinking about the noise which is most desirable. And so I did want to talk a little bit more eventually about light rail, and also, of course, in Auckland, we have the privilege of ferry. And all of those modes are electrified or going to be electrified. And so, you know, that's a huge positive when we think about great urban environments. When we also talk about transport and how you get urban intensification going, we talk often about rapid transit. Actually, rapid transit is a very alienating form. It needs really huge corridors, few stops, and it's all about moving people as quickly as possible. And the transport link essentially is a bit like a sewer. It's very functional, get the stuff through as quickly as possible with as few blockages as possible. And that is a little bit, and that's a little bit sort of negative, but actually sewers are really critical for urban development. So don't underestimate the importance of a sewer. And we've actually got a lot of those kind of transport bits of thinking and also in our corridors now. And of course, motorways are a pretty good example of that in terms of when you think about urban intensification. So look, I wanted to just talk then in terms of the context of what we actually have to do in Auckland. So the massive challenge that we've got to basically support the decarbonisation of Auckland's transport fleet, while also increasing equity, increasing quality of life, reducing fossil fuel use hugely, and that means VKT have to be travelled less than they are today. And to also move differently require us to also live differently. And that's where, as Tommy has mentioned, the concept of urban intensification is so critical. And it does need to be around those transport modes which have the light urban footprint, but are also great places to live. And actually, the great places to live is where we start to get some really very big challenges. I wanted to talk about two kind of areas briefly, where I think there has been an opportunity which is still on the way. So the first, I want to talk about Hobsonville Point, which is a planned new urbanist development of high density developed by the Crown as an exemplar for Auckland. And yet I can tell you, because I had every hat there, from Waka Kotahi Auckland Transport, chair of the Hobsonville Land Company that actually developed it, we didn't ever get the transport story entirely right. So there are still opportunities there, but basically we've developed the high density suburb and we have still not got the active and the low carbon transport story correct. And the answer right now is that most households have got 2 or more cars. There's provision for 1 in terms of car parking on the site. And there is basically still a huge opportunity at Hobsonville Point to connect with the community and get a much better transport story than we've currently got, including the current proposal to put in a new motorway on-ramp and basically further drive private car use. So there's an opportunity begging. The other great urban development regeneration which has occurred, still underway, is Wynyard. And the wonderful thing about Wynyard is right beside the central city. And the reality of being able to live a life without a car and to be able to walk, cycle, and get to PT, even if it's 2 or 3 blocks away, is real. And as we get things like e-bike, e-scooters, and all those kind of things, that is the way people are choosing to live if you actually make provision for it right from the outset. And Wynyard Quarter is a fantastic example of really how you do that. So look, I could talk all day about these matters and I don't have the chance to do it. So I will wrap up by just actually saying the real pudding here is the delivery, not the planning. The planning's critical. The delivery is where it really happens. We've got Kāinga Ora, we've got Waka Kotahi, we've got Eke Panuku, and we've got Auckland Transport. And it's a time that those big delivery agencies were required together to deliver much faster and better urban intensification for Auckland without a whole lot of new special purpose vehicles.
Thank you, Adrienne. Just so picking up on that, what you took us to the delivery bit. So for Auckland to implement and deliver, what is the change we need to get from where we are to where we need to be? Is it institutional? Is it something else?
The power of plans, of course. We've got the Auckland plan, we've got the Regional Land Transport Plan, and we have got we've actually got ATAP, which is a funding document. We need a similar urban intensification document, which binds all the delivery agencies.
Thank you, Adrienne. That was a wonderful panel, insightful session. I would love to do questions, but I know we've sort of got less than a minute left in our timing to finish this component. If there was one question I could put to the panel, and I might send this to Adrienne. Adrienne, what is the question here says, would be interested to hear views on behavior change and the role of tools such as pricing.
Behavior change, hearts and minds is where it's all at when it comes to thinking differently about how we live, how we travel. We've got to get actually into the choices that people are prepared to make. You start with great information, okay, and that was, I think, was one of the points made by one of the speakers early on. Evidence and great information is a really important place to start. Don't underestimate the ability of people to change the way they do things.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would love to thank Malcolm, Tommy, Rebecca, and Adrienne for this fantastic session. May we take Auckland forward and may we take New Zealand forward in this narrative on public transport and urban regeneration. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Phil, who'll take us back to the main session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayurie, and thank you also to our sponsor, Arup, silver sponsors for the conference, and for hosting the session and running a very insightful session on the role of urban planning and transport. It's clear from what we heard that a multifaceted approach is required to face the problems of reshaping, regenerating, repurposing, and resilience within the urban environment. The presentation gave us this huge insight into the diverse experiences and diverse views, which is a great segue into our next session, which we'll be hearing about diverse thinking, and with our lead from Alia Bajova at 1 o'clock, and I welcome you to the next session. Thank you.